Good morning, everybody. Welcome at the technical sessions on climate policy evaluation of the Inclusive Forum on Carbon Mitigation Approaches, and in particular, the Nigeria pilot of IFCMA. We're taking a few more minutes to let people in, and then I'll start introducing today's program. Okay, I think we should have everybody who's there for this morning session. We are a relatively big group, so maybe as a means of introduction. So maybe, yeah, let's maybe first start. So my name is Jules Schers of the OECD Environment Directorate, and I'm the coordinator of the sectoral modeling of the IFCMA pilot. And for today, as I mentioned, we're quite a big group, but maybe everybody can briefly say their name and their affiliation in the chat, so that we know who you are. And then I'll start with presenting an overview of today's program. Okay, sorry, I'm still not sharing. Yes. Can everybody see my screen?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, good to hear. I'm just making sure that I can see the chat as well. So yeah, welcome once more. As many of you know, the Inclusive Forum of Carbon Mitigation Approaches is a Secretary General initiative of the OECD, in which the OECD works also with non-OECD countries on developing a better understanding of what works in climate mitigation policies. And as part of the IFCMA, we have 3 pilot studies for which we do a policy stocktake, as well as modeling of the impact of current policies. And Nigeria is one of the pilot countries. And today we're having technical sessions which are part of the pilot work, in which we are going to discuss approaches to taking stock of current policies and on modeling the impacts of current policies. And the work for the Nigeria pilot is co-funded by the European Commission, notably the Director General of TaxSud. And so we thank them for their generous support to this work stream. And the work is done on the OECD side by teams of 3 directorates, and I forgot to mention one important one here on this slide. So we have the Environment Directorate, the Economics Department, and the Center for Tax Policy and Administration, who are involved on the OECD side. And we also have external partners in the 3 different pilots, which are the Paul Scher Institute, Centro Energia of the University of Chile, and the Center for Climate Change and Development of the IFCMA Federal University in Nigeria, as well as colleagues from other academic institutes in Nigeria and CIRET in France. So IFCMA, like I said, is about understanding what works in climate policy, and to improve climate mitigation policy. And the IFCMA has a few different work streams, and of which a few of them will be presented over the course of today and tomorrow. So the first pillar of IFCMA is the development of a climate policy database for the IFCMA members, which will be the topic of the next session. And it takes stock of climate relevant policies, so not only climate mitigation policies, and also developed a mapping methodology of greenhouse gas emissions to estimate the emission base of current policies. The other pillar is the evaluation of current policies, in which one part is about ex post analysis of policy effectiveness. And the other part, which will be also presented later today, is about combined sectoral and economy-wide modeling of selected policies. These 2 pillars are the first elements of IFCMA, and are both present in the pilot studies, and the pilot studies concern Switzerland, Chile, and Nigeria. And in each pilot study, as you see on this slide, we have different sectors that are being studied, and a national partner. The other work streams in IFCMA are a work stream on international spillovers, in which we analyze the positive and negative spillovers to across borders of climate mitigation policies and response options. So you can think of an emission trading system and a carbon border adjustment, but also technology spillovers and other spillovers. This topic will be part in the program tomorrow at the end of the day. And finally, the IFCMA is also working on carbon intensity metrics to develop a shared methodology across IFCMA members on interoperable carbon intensity metrics, in which the OECD Secretariat assesses and compares data sources, and also assesses potential monitoring, reporting, and verification systems. So today, as I mentioned, on the program, the first session, which will start in a few minutes from now, is about the IFCMA policy stocktake and database and their application to Nigeria. And we'll have, after that session, we'll have a short lunch break from until 1 p.m. and at which time we will start our second session with on forestry policy modeling in GlobeIM and G4M and their application to Nigeria by the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis, IIASA, in Luxembourg in Austria. There will be a short coffee break in the afternoon, and then we'll close today's sessions with a session which I'll present on applying ex-ante sectoral modeling tools for evaluation of current policies. So yeah, let me not take up more time because it's time to give the floor to my colleagues. So I'll stop sharing, and so with us here today, we have Astrid Tricaud and Dirk Rutgers, both of the Center for Tax Policy and Administration at the OECD. Astrid is an economist, and her work focuses on market-based instruments related to climate change mitigation and carbon pricing instruments, as well as the economic analysis of policies in the transport sector. And for IFCMA, she has led the Nigeria Stocktake and greenhouse gas mapping exercise together with the Trade and Agriculture Directorate. Previously, she has worked for the French Treasury on foreign aid and household taxation. Dirk Rutgers is also an economist at the Center for Tax Policy and Administration, and he's leading the work on the IFCMA Climate Policy Database. He has 18 years experience as an economist, of which 10 years at the OECD, and his work focuses on climate change mitigation and related topics like green finance and large-scale investments, as well as cross-border investment activities. Dirk has a big background in environmental and development economics and holds a PhD from the University of Hanover and a master's degree of the University of Göttingen. Astrid or Dirk, to who can I give the floor first?
To me, and thank you very much, Jules, for the generous introduction. So welcome everyone from our side as well to session 1, which will be on the policy stocktake and the resulting database, and in particular on how we apply what we do there to the Nigerian case, to the Nigerian country pilot study. So again, welcome everyone to our presentation on, there it goes. Our presentation on what we call the CPD, the IFCMA Climate Policy Database. So what we do with this database is to build a standardized, and I have to emphasize this, a very detailed inventory of policy instruments. In particular, as the whole of the IFCMA, we're looking into climate change mitigation and also include mitigation-relevant policy instruments. And I'll unpack in a second what that actually means. The database aims to support climate change mitigation action through better data, as does the whole of the IFCMA, and through better information sharing and evidence-based mutual learning. So we're hoping that the evidence that we gather in this database can help, peer learning through the IFCMA as a platform, if you will. The database itself focuses on policy design, and again, a term that I'll unpack in a second. And we describe policy instruments in the database through recording policy targets. So what is actually and who is actually affected by these policies directly, and recording the policy intensity. So, you would expect that, right? The rate of a carbon tax, for example, that's the policy intensity of the carbon tax. That's reported, of course. And, as a novelty and, an extension of a methodology that we use on a smaller scale, we also show as descriptive or as describing the policy, the GHG emission coverage, which, the first session tomorrow will chiefly be about, which shows which emissions or emission segments are actually covered by a policy instrument. So in this presentation, I would like to show you the CPD structure and give you a bit of an insight into, what that structure looks like when it's filled, i.e. the results that we have for the 2025 edition of the database. And then Astrid will discuss the pilot study for Nigeria and how it relates to the climate policy database. So what, through the lens of the climate policy database, the Nigerian policy landscape looks like. With that said, let's start with, the structure of the CPD, the Climate Policy Database, and you have to forgive me for using that abbreviation continuously now. But that's the local vernacular, if you will. So, as I said, we focus on policy instruments. Policy instruments to us are institutional tools through which governments either influence or mandate or enforce or guide behavior. And we take these verbs very seriously, since by these functions of policy instrument, we we split up the categories of instruments that we look at. As I said, the CPD is a very detailed inventory of both climate change mitigation and climate change mitigation relevant policy instruments. So what do we mean by that? We mean that we distinguish between those on the left side here that have explicit climate objectives, that's climate change mitigation instruments, and those that don't have explicit climate objectives. So on the explicit climate objective side, I think we can all think of some of them. We listed some of those that we already include in the database, like carbon taxes. It's clear that, at least typically, these policy instruments do have climate objectives. Right? Same for emission trading systems, same for bans on new coal power plants and similar. So needless to say, these need to be included in a database about climate change mitigation. And we do have a longer list than you see here of these kinds of instruments. However, there are also climate change mitigation relevant instruments, those that were included for other reasons than climate objectives. Like a fuel excise tax, for example, may just have been introduced for revenue raising through taxing. Nevertheless, we know that this is relevant for climate change mitigation. The fuel excise tax can have a very, very unmitigated effect on climate change, due to a quasi-linear relation between the fuel that is taxed, or the amount of fuel that is taxed, and the amount of emissions that's resulting from using that fuel. And we have others like fossil fuel subsidies, speed limits, energy efficiency labels. I think we can all think of reasons why those will be introduced that have nothing to do with climate change. Nevertheless, we can all imagine, it's easy to imagine how these policies have effects that affect climate change mitigation. So we introduced this. And to go further, on how we get to the scope of the database, or rather to hedge the scope, we also built a typology. As I said, we focus on policy instruments as opposed to other policy action, like plans and targets, for example. So we focus on the concrete policy instrument level. Again, we take these verbs very seriously, where policies incentivize, mandate, enable, or guide behavior. And to scope out the climate policy database, and also to know which, how to categorize these policy instruments, we built this typology. It's aligned with the typology used by the UNFCCC. And we put policy instruments here into 5 categories according to, do they incentivize? That's an economic instrument. Do they mandate? That's a regulatory instrument. And otherwise, they are the other 3 categories: investment, consumption, information instruments, and voluntary projects. We further categorize these 5 categories into groups of 3 each, so 15 in total. So economic instruments, for example, have subsidies, they have taxes, they have trading systems, and each policy instrument is put in exactly one of these groups. So these groups are mutually exclusive. Within these groups, then you find a long list of policies. Currently, I'll talk more about this in a second. Currently, we have 43 policy instruments which fit these instrument groups, but we aim to add more, because clearly there are more more relevant policies within this typology. So this typology is there to classify policy instruments and to give us the scope, but it doesn't tell us how to record the detail of these policies, how to describe these policies best. For that, we have to think about how do we want to characterize a policy instrument, and how do we in practice do this to keep it feasible. As I said, we through the incentive structure, so through these verbs that I was talking about, we group these policies, and that's where the typology comes from. Enough said about that. Further than that, we determine who and what is affected, i.e. we look at the regulatory base. So that's what I meant earlier by saying we focus on policy design. So for example, we look into who is affected. Is it an electricity producer? Is it any firm? Is it households generally? That kind of thing. Or we don't know what is affected. For example, what's taxed here? Is it a car? Is it the fuel? Is it the emission? And this we structure and standardize through the headings of assets, agents, and activities. So a car for example, would be an asset, and a firm or a household would be an agent. And besides that, we also collect information on the intensity, as I mentioned earlier. So intensity, think of a tax rate, think of the level of a subsidy, think of the level of a standard, for example, or threshold for a standard. That's the intensity. And also those, like the regulatory base information we collect, we standardize as much as we can. So intensity, for example, the $10 per ton CO2 equivalent, that would be, the intensity, i.e. the tax rate of a carbon tax, just as an example. And another really important category for us is the emissions base, which we also record again. So emissions base, that's the GHG emissions coverage that I mentioned earlier, and that will be the focus of the first session tomorrow. It determines, or it shows the GHG emissions that are covered by an instrument. And we have a good basis for getting to that information through the information that we have on the regulatory base, which shows us, okay, where do emissions come from? And then we can check how many emissions do we have from that regulatory base. Do we have data on this? Do we have to apply additional methodology? And then calculate the emission base for a further descriptor of an instrument. To, again, relate it to emissions and therefore, get closer to our goal of saying something about climate change mitigation. In particular, we, of course, collect much more information than what you see here. This is the type of information we aim to focus on. That's, to us, this is a reflection of the policy design and helps us compare policies across countries. We do collect a lot more information, however. And you see it here distinguished by 5 blocks. The first block, names and description, and the second, administrative information, is relatively straightforward, like what's the policy named, which sector does it affect, so in terms of emissions, but also in terms of economic sector. Administrative information, similar, which country is it in, does it, when did that policy start, who is administering that policy, so which ministry, that's the administrative authority. So that kind of information. Then the third block is what I just discussed, policy base and intensity. And I will say here that we're summarizing for this slide because otherwise it will be too many attributes, as we call them. So think of them if instruments is a line in a spreadsheet, that each attribute is a column. So there would be too many here, but take this as a representation of information that we gather on the asset, the agent, and activity in the policy base and intensity block. And then the intensity itself, of course. We standardize these values as much as we can, just to make sure that on the and I have to face the trade-off that on the one hand we want to give space to the nuance of policy making, and on the other we want to keep this comparable. So this has given us a bit of a headache in the last 1.5 years or so to navigate this trade-off. Some clear examples are, if it says car or cars or passenger car, then, standardize that term. And then there are some, more difficult cases that maybe we can get to in a discussion. Compliance mechanisms is a fourth block, and then we have instrument-specific attributes, simply to reflect some of the nuance I just mentioned. For taxes, you may want to know other descriptors of a policy than, for example, for subsidies. For taxes, you may want to know, what's the amount of revenue gained through a tax. Whereas for subsidy, for example, more typically you would want to know what's the floor or ceiling of the subsidy, what's the overall limit across the program of that subsidy. Things like that we put in specific attributes by instrument group. So that's so far on the structure, what the CPD looks like. Before I move into the next part, I just want to quickly ask, are there any questions already? You may want to raise a hand, you may just want to speak directly. And also just to give me a breather. I don't think
I don't see questions on the chat, but maybe so.
I have one, Jules and Dirk. Thank you very much. Very interesting. I'm Frédéric Garcy from CIRAD. I was wondering about price regulations, in fact, because they tend to be quite complex in different countries. In many, many countries, energy prices are regulated by governments or or even other institutions, and this tends to be opaque in many instances, and it's very hard to track how this is done, and yet it has very strong influence on energy consumptions, of course. Can you just elaborate a bit on how they would be covered?
Thank you. Thank you for that question. Indeed, very relevant, especially in current times. I think we will see a lot of this we are seeing this a lot already. And while we plan to cover this, and build on the fossil fuel, what is it called? Fossil fuel, not it's subsidies inventory. Okay, the OECD fossil fuel subsidies inventory. We currently do not include this, to be fair. And if I'm honest, I haven't quite tackled this. We have some ideas, but this is maybe not the right place for me to discuss them. I'm very sorry not to directly answer that question.
Dick?
Okay, good.
Professor Kereke?
Okay, I have a question. This work is extensive, but I'm struck that you have not included targets and goals, and I wondered whether you can offer a justification for that decision, because I think targets and goals can also be a major way that governments influence and guide behavior in this issue area. Then the second point is about education and the information. I know that some parts of information instruments are included, but broad-based education, which can also, albeit mostly indirectly, exert tremendous influence and guide on behavior, are excluded. So could you speak to those 2 points, please?
Okay, thanks a lot for those 2 questions. So the one on the targets and goals, you obviously very right there that this can be an important factor and a deciding factor even in climate change mitigation policy making, or policy effectiveness even. We chose to focus on policy instruments because we initially wanted to look at the most concrete expression of policy making, and also wanted to have something that we actually could record and work with. Whereas targets and goals are, tend to be vaguer, not necessarily all of the time, but some of the time it's not clear, how much this is actually. So which of these verbs it would fit basically, because it may just be a recommendation, and then lines are blurry between those. Having said that, we are working on extending. So maybe I can show it again. We're working on extending this typology. This is only for policy instruments, but you can, at this highest level of the policy instrument, you can easily imagine a second item next to it that goes into targets and goals, and plans for that matter, which in some countries are super central, really. And we are working on extending this typology, so this is also included, and would simply ask for your patience here of finishing this change in the typology, and to see where this goes in terms of collection. But we're strongly considering adding this to the typology. And on education, and generally where this would fall for us, the information instruments category here, the 4th category. I believe we do have an information instrument already collected.
We have reporting requirements.
Yes, thank you. Reporting requirements, at least. It's not exactly education in the sense that I think you mean. But we, as we go along and extend the database across the 43 instruments that we currently have, we will consider more instruments that go in that direction. And I believe for the current update, which I'll talk about in a second, there are already some considered here. But frankly, this is done by our colleagues in the Environment Directorate who are not here today. So I prefer not to speak out of turn on which ones we include, but we do agree this should be included, and in principle already is included in the topology.
But then you have voluntary targets, but not national targets. You know, in the last slide. Anyway,
it was hard to hear. What's your question? If targets are already included?
Yeah, one of the slides, the previous slide that you showed, it has voluntary targets. If you can go back to it, you see in the, not this one, where, can you go back? Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know.
You mean here?
Just voluntary, yeah. So it's confusing that we have voluntary targets, which I suspect you mean like when companies mention or offer targets for what they want to achieve, but then we don't have national targets. So I'm confused. Then also under information instrument we have training, which if you argue that by policy instrument you mean you cannot pose on the ground, or provisions that lead to pose on the ground, then training and awareness don't actually fit that, which is why I think that then education. So there is need for more analytical rigor in the way we define what is included and what is not included, so that if we are not going to have targets, then we should not have, if we're not going to have national targets, then we should not have voluntary targets. And if we're going to have training and awareness too, then we should have education. Things to think about later. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. And you're of course, very right in terms of voluntary targets for firms. This is already included in the topology, and I think I would have to find the list, which maybe I can do in a second. I think these policies will be, so a voluntary target policy will be included in the future extension for the instruments. So I didn't want to throw in the voluntary targets for firms as a policy instrument with national targets for emission reduction. Those are of course two different things. What I was talking about earlier as an additional category beside policy instruments, I was talking about national targets there, and for the voluntary targets for firms, which can of course be framed by national policy, which then would be a policy instrument in our sense. That of course could be included, and again I think will be may be included for the update that we're preparing for 2026. Again, thanks a lot. And while we're on updates, maybe I can introduce you to the database proper, and then discuss just in 1 or 2 sentences the update as well. I hope I'm not missing any questions here, but please stop me if I do. Okay, good. So we discussed the structure, and what could or couldn't be in this database. And based on this structure, we're proud to say that we produced the 2025 edition and released it on the 16th of December 2025, so not too long ago. It includes 38 countries, those countries that have actively validated their country data. So there's a process of collection on our side and a validation on the side of the countries. And it includes, as I said, 43 policy instrument types. And these and by type, I mean a carbon tax, or carbon taxes generally are a type. And then, ban on coal power plants is another type of policy. And then we have 1,605 individual policy instruments in the database. So that's 1,605 expressions of these 43 policy instrument types. So that's, the German carbon tax, the French carbon tax, the Japanese, and so on. And as I keep saying, we focus on policy design described through standardized attributes. So that's the story about the cars and on the assets that I told earlier. Include the policy intensity, and aim to also include the GHG emission coverage of policy instruments in the future. Currently, this database is a snapshot for 2024, at least for most policy instruments. Some are 2023. Some data refers to 2023. And we plan, as I mentioned, to update this. So this is the 2025 edition that confusingly refers to 2024 data. And for the 2026 data, we update this with more policies and hopefully the full membership of the IFCMA, which would be 59 countries. Beyond the database, as you can tell from how I'm talking about this, I think we set up a systematic process. So we validate this data together with the delegates. We have a process internally for collecting the data, which adheres to all the methodology set out by our thoughts about standardization, for example, and the typology. And we then apply a systematic process with an online platform to communicate with the countries so that they validate the data together with us, so that the data in the end is official data. And we, of course, aim to improve on this and otherwise repeat this process. And we're ready to scale up. We plan to expand the coverage to more instruments. Say, don't quote me on this later, but say around 60 instruments is what we're aiming for the 2026 edition. Since now we're moving beyond the low-hanging fruit and the clear inclusions like fossil fuel subsidies and price control, which is much harder to, or some of these at least are much harder to collect, as we've just discussed. For the database that we already have, once the slide deck is circulated, you'll be able to click the link in the banner up here. In the meantime, what you would see then is this snapshot where you in the bottom right could download the raw data through this button. So you would get all these 1,600 policy instruments and additional detail. And IFCMA members can even request additional information through for the ad hoc analysis simply through writing to us. Since I cannot possibly represent the whole database here, I just at least wanted to show you some of the figures that we put on the climate policy dashboard, and go through the first 3 tabs of that dashboard, give you a little bit of an overview of what we include, show you how we display a country policy landscape, and then show you what we can do for at least one instrument. So what does the dashboard cover generally? So that would be the first tab of that dashboard. The database records which emission sectors are targeted by instruments, and the most covered sectors by the CPD are buildings, transport, and energy industry sectors, at least when counting the instrument types that we cover through these sectors. And on the figure to the right here, you see which sectors are covered by how many of these 43 instrument types. So you see that buildings, a lot of these instrument types apply to the building sector. And that we already include 7 of the 15 groups that I showed earlier. So, for example, all groups under the economics category, taxes, subsidies, and trading schemes are included in the database currently. And, even for a simple figure that counts instrument types, you can already, see something interesting, which here, for example, is that taxes tend to cover the economy more widely. So taxes, that's the dark green bars. They're represented across all sectors, whereas performance standards are notably a large category for the building sector here, and less so for others. So that's an overview on the dashboard on the webpage. You will find more details, and even in the overview tab, and even more for the country level in the country level data tab. So that's where the country policy landscape is displayed. And what you see here, since unfortunately we don't have the Nigeria data up yet, is the country policy landscape as far as it is already recorded in our database for Chile, which, as Jules mentioned, is one of the other pilot countries that we have. And this is, I'm a bit in a bind here because I'm showing an interactive figure in a PowerPoint presentation. So forgive me for trying to show you some of the interactivity, but it's just a nice figure to play around in on the dashboard, where you can, discover the depth of the descriptive data that we put in there. So you see these bubbles, and once you click on one of these bubbles, you'll get more information which policies are actually within this tax category. And then even further, once you click into it, we'll go into a view that shows you, well, the name of these policies, names of these policies, as well as some of the details. So here, if you look at this large box for the assets, you can see the categorized assets that we include here. But there's much more in the data once you download it if you want to know even more about this. So that's the country policy landscape. And then we go through the third tab, which are the instruments. So as I said earlier, we include quite a bit of nuance on the instruments in the database. And at some point, it's hard to show this across instruments. You want to dig into single instruments, which here I'm showing the example. We have many more on the dashboard for the EV subsidies and the eligibility criteria that we record on these subsidies. So first off, the view here shows cars only as opposed to buses, trucks, and motorcycles. And this heat map distinguishes by other factors in the policy landscape. So does the EV subsidy exist together with flanking mechanisms like EV sales mandates and ICE bans, or just one of them or none of them? And which powertrain the EV has. Like, is it purely a battery electric vehicle? Is it a fuel cell electric vehicle even? Or is it a plug-in hybrid? And these distinctions we can only make because we not only collect this detail, but also standardize it so we can compare across countries and draw averages across countries. And it's very clear here through the heat map that battery electric vehicles and in a landscape with no other flanking, or where these two flanking mechanisms do not exist, there the subsidy is the highest out of all the countries on average. And then there's some more detail that we show, but this to say that generally that the CPD allows for looking into policy mix considerations in great detail. And this figure in particular, it just happens to show that average financial support across vehicle types and powertrains for different policy mixes is highest without flanking policies and for BEVs. And this is just, the small insight on the small demonstration I wanted to give on the dashboard. I hope I could whet your appetite for actually visiting the dashboard. IFCMA Climate Policy Dashboard in Google will also get you there. But there will be a web link in the presentation. I see there was a question in the chat. So before we go to the next session with Astrid, the volume is really, I assume this is low. Okay. Okay, just a technical question. But if there are any questions on, happy to answer them if I can.
This is not a technical question, but when do you envisage that Nigerian data will be uploaded on the platform, the dashboard?
Very good and timely question. So as I said earlier, we currently include the 38 countries that validated the data. And we're currently working with other countries, including Nigeria. We had a really nice meeting with Adesola last week on the validation of this data for an inclusion in the database. So for countries that haven't been included yet, but that have validated since December or planning to in the very near future, we will include them in an update that we plan to put online on the 17th of April. So in less than a month's time, hopefully Nigeria would be included. But again, this is dependent on validation through the countries.
I'm sorry, feel free to not answer the question if it's sensitive, but what is holding the validation? Because a sensitive amount of work has already been put in the compilation. And then we have the IFCMA here. So what's holding the validation?
I'm wondering if Adesola wants to jump in here, but we had a meeting last week to discuss a few points with Adesola on which we will react. still. We'll react very soon with an email that will hopefully sort out some of the last points, which were mostly about, how would this data be represented. But Adesola, since you're here, I would invite you to jump in if you want to add something. That was Adesola earlier who said you couldn't quite hear us super well. So, maybe I can leave it at that. And we can move to Astrid. Okay.
Thank you, Dirk. So now we are switching to a part which will be focused on results for Nigeria, and more precisely for the pilot part. So I will first go through a summary of what the Nigeria pilot process and objective were, and then we will go through the results. So first, the objective. So this pilot study for Nigeria is part of a series of 3 pilot studies, and the first 2 countries were Switzerland and Chile. And the objective of these pilot studies are to prepare the scale-up of the climate policy database by exploring different contexts. So different policy mix, for instance, in Nigeria, you will see later that there are more instruments which are regulations and taxes, and also explore different contexts for data collection. Because, for instance, in some countries, you will have a very detailed website with all the laws and how they evolved over time. And for some other countries, information is less obvious to find. And in the case of Nigeria, what was very interesting for us is the great share of greenhouse gas emission from the AFOLU sector. And so it was the occasion to explore a new sector for us. So agriculture and forestry. So the scope of this pilot study, I just spoke about it. It's transport, but also agriculture and LULUCF. And we cover instruments which are at the federal level and also implemented at the level of states, up to 50% of their cumulative GDP. So we do 50% of greenhouse gas emission if data are available. Otherwise, we use GDP as a proxy. But in the case of Nigeria, actually, the information that we found were almost all at the federal level. Also, in terms of temporality, instruments that were collected were active either in 2024, 2023, 2024, or 2025. So a scope which is slightly bigger than the climate policy database. How did we manage this pilot for the Stocktake part? So we did desk research, like the secretariat, so the Center of Tax Policy and Administration, jointly with our colleague in the Trade and Environment Directorate, as well as in the Environment Directorate. And for AFOLU, we also benefited from the help from a consultant, so Cosmas, who is connected also now. And more specifically for AFOLU, we also relied on an existing database produced at the OECD called IFCMA AFOLU, which was first released something like 1 year ago, and which developed a typology which is closely aligned with the IFCMA one. So they do not incorporate instrument for Nigeria yet, but we could rely on their typology to do the pilot study. So now I will go through the results. So we collected 41 instruments for the sectors mentioned, 15 in the transport sector, 17 in LULUCF, 7 in agriculture, and 2 in both LULUCF and agriculture sector. And here, when I speak about the sector, it means a sector where these instruments can potentially have an impact. And we can see on this graph that there are differences in instrument type across sectors. So, for instance, for transport instruments, we have a majority of public investment. And this is mainly due to the recent CNG and electric vehicle initiative from the presidency, which has several instruments such as the support for new natural gas charging station or natural gas powered buses or conversion centers, and all this feed into this category of public investment in public infrastructure. Looking at the AFOLU sector, so we have a bit more diversity in terms of instruments, but they are mainly framework regulation and public investment. So framework regulation, it is due to numerous zoning instruments, which intends to protect specific area, for instance, watershed or forest. And for public investment, instruments classified there are often support for afforestation, which is for which we assume that it's done on public land and not done through like giving plantations or plants directly to a community on private areas. Another attribute of the database is the time where the instruments was adopted, and this is what we will see now. So for transport, you have the graph here on the slide. You can see that there are numerous recent instruments, so 9 over like these 2 years, 2023 and 2024. And again, as mentioned previously, this is mainly due to the support for natural gas and electric vehicles, which began to be implemented recently. Now for agriculture, what you can see is that we have 2 different peaks in a way. Which are, so it's for agriculture and LULUCF actually. The first one is, so in the around 2010, and it was mainly for LULUCF, for lands protection. Several regulations were implemented at that time. And then for agriculture, the peak is more recent, so around 2020. Several regulations were active, were implemented at that time, so more recently. So now we are switching to another attribute of the database, which is the administrating authorities. And for transport instruments, we can see that they are administered by very diverse authorities. So again, a key role of agency directly under the presidency, such as the CNG initiative. You have also a commission for road safety. And then a lot of other instruments are implemented directly by the Ministry of Finance. So overall, a few roles was left for the Ministry of Transport directly. The main instrument that we found administered by the Ministry of Transport was subsidies for motorcycles, electric motorcycles. For the AFOLO instruments, we saw more concentration. We saw a central role of the Ministry of Environment, as well as several departments involved, as well as agencies which are under the supervision of the Ministry of Environment. For instance, the Great Green Wall Agency, but also the National Environmental Standards and Regulation Enforcement Agency. Another attribute which is really central to this database and which also brings a lot of value to this climate policy database is the intensity, and it expresses how much an instrument put constraints or incentives on economic actions. And this is an attribute which can be challenging to fill because you don't always have like a single line in documents that you find online saying, okay, this is this amount, for instance, of subsidies for this year for this instruments. So for some instruments, it will be very obvious, for instance, a tax rate for a tax, but for other, it may be less obvious and also difficult to find. If we look into the database, like the pilot database, pilot Stocktake, here are a few examples of such intensities. For instance, for taxes, you have a tax rate. Here is the example of the import tax, which is expressed as a percentage of vehicle value. You also have subsidies or public investments for which you can seek for budget spend or number of assets which are subsidized. Here you have, for instance, the yearly amount of subsidies for gasoline. For regulatory instruments, it can be a threshold. For instance, here you have the biofuel blending requirement. 10% of ethanol is requested. And finally, you have trainings also, and here it will be the number of persons trained. So we do not have a precise example because information we collected for this instrument were over several years usually. So we put them in the description, but it was not a specific intensity for 1 year. So as a conclusion, this climate policy database is useful. I hope that you find that it's a useful tool. It's available online and it provides information on climate mitigation relevant instruments in a standardized structure and with recurrent updates. So here what you can find is the first edition online, but there will be further updates. In parallel, so we led a pilot study for Nigeria on a scope which is slightly different from the one of the climate policy database currently. So transport, agriculture, and LULUCF sectors. And we have seen that in Nigeria we have a rich and dynamic policy mix in place, mostly based on public investments and regulations. And to have a bridge with like the overarching objective of this training, it's important to say that this database can be useful for modelers because it gives information for modeling. For instance, you can select instruments, you can see, does this instrument exist, or doesn't it exist in this country? And it additionally gives details on their implementation. For instance, what is the temporal scope, what is the intensity, what are the economic sectors, and what is policy or regulatory base. Also, if not information are already available, it can give a first basis for further research, because you have links to legislation, and we can also discuss. This is what happened for the current modeling exercise for the Nigeria pilot. And another use for modelers is that it provides information on the greenhouse gas emissions potentially impacted. But this will be explained in another session tomorrow. So thank you very much for listening to this presentation, and we are happy to take any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Astrid, and thank you, Dirk. I'll give people a moment to respond and raise hands or put questions in the chat. Does anybody would anybody like to know more about specific aspects of the database or its application to Nigeria?
Yes. So I see Frédéric Gercy.
Thank you very much for the presentation again. This is more of a general comment, I think. I am thinking that, and maybe this is just something you can disambiguate, but I am thinking that the focus may be too much on the, say, the positive instruments, those that are indeed targeting emissions, and so those that are pro-mitigation to some extent, but that there is also a lot of regulation, a lot of policy making that is in fact building up the emission score. And so indeed, when you think of subsidies, these are indeed probably not going in the right direction, although there are some mitigation subsidies, because of course you will subsidize things that you want to see gain momentum into the country, but they may also be negative subsidies. And so yes, this is just a general question on whether you, of course, I suppose you have given thought to this, and I was wondering how you try to integrate both the positive and the negative policy making into the database, broadly speaking. Thank you very much for very interesting presentations.
Yes, thank you. Indeed, when you have a policy mix, you can have like instruments going in one direction and other instruments in an opposite direction. So it's good to take account of all the package. So as Dirk mentioned previously, so this it is an interactive database. So the scope of the instruments which are collected is negotiated regularly. And so far, so what we included this pilot is a subsidy for gasoline. So we have at least one instrument which has potentially indeed a negative impact on greenhouse gas emissions. But it's like more, and we can also think about, so we didn't find any in the case of Nigeria, but subsidies for fertilizers or such instruments. But it would be like more for the future of the database.
Yeah, exactly. Just if I may add just quickly, the future of the database is the pivotal point here. Of course, we focused on Mostly, explicit mitigation instruments, but fossil fuel subsidies are, the related policy instruments are definitely a group of policy instrument that we're looking into for inclusion. Even maybe, hopefully, I don't want to go too far here, but hopefully in the 2026 edition we will have some of them already. And then, sometimes it's in the details, as Astrid said, some exemptions for fuel excess taxes are actually covered. It's harder to bring out because they're rarely an instrument. They're usually what we call a sub-scheme to an instrument. And in the database itself, you will see a lot of these sub-schemes. For example, a reduction of the tax rate for certain uses like agricultural diesel, for example. So some of this is already covered. Others, like some fossil fuel subsidies, based on the OECD inventory of fossil fuel support. That's what the database is called. I was referring to earlier. That hopefully will come in the future, and we're indeed, as you say, very well aware of this and are discussing internally what we can do and what is feasible.
Thank you, Dirk and Astrid. I hope that answers Frederick's question and comment. In the chat, we have a question by Cosmas, who was wondering if there is already a timeline for the validation of the Nigerian database.
So, I'll basically repeat my answer from earlier that by 17th of April, we would like to upload the database if the day, if we can, and we're, doing our best, all sides, and for getting this data validated to validated status. And if we can, wrap this up by that time, it will be included in that database. Otherwise, the next chance would be an inclusion in the November release of the 2026 update. Hopefully we'll do it on 17th of April. And by the way, I'm talking about the data that would be in the Climate Policy Database, which wouldn't include the FULU policy instruments.
Yes, exactly. It's important to mention that we are speaking about like two different exercises here. So study instruments from the pilot study, unless they are already covered by this first edition of the Climate Policy Database, won't be public. They will be used and summarized in a dedicated brief, which will be published later in 2027, likely.
Thank you, Astrid. Thank you, Dirk. I'm looking in the chat and the participant list if there's further questions. I see Chika Anya Chor, and I hope I pronounced your name correctly, asking a question in the chat. Were there particular issues you faced with collecting data from Nigerian subnational authorities? I assume it's about, and would and how could those challenges be mitigated in your experience?
Yeah, so indeed it was quite difficult to find instruments at the subnational level, mainly due to lack of available data online. So it was really the main reason. A second one could be questions about how these instruments may interact with the federal level. For instance, if you have public investment at the subnational level, would have this not been covered already by some public spending that we accounted for at the federal level and which would have been redistributed afterward. But the main reason was really that we lack information.
And Astrid, can I ask you for a response on the second part of your question? So how would you is there a way that that these challenges could be solved, or?
So if you have any available contacts at subnational level, we would be happy to exchange with them and to see how we can incorporate some of the instruments.
Thank you, Astrid. Chika, I hope it answers your question. We are approaching the end of this session. Thank you. And so I was wondering, we'll have a few more minutes for very last questions. Frederic is asking, is there any information on the level of enforcement of the policies? A tax may be voted, but raised on a part of consumption only.
There are two parts to this answer. Only on part of the consumption only, that is exactly what we mean by policy base and capturing the policy base. So, when we capture this in the database, we may describe the assets, like, let's take the fuel excise as an example. The law may say, when it's voted, it may say, fuels or, fuels for road transport. And then, in practice, it may only be applied to diesel with a full amount. And this is exactly what we capture in our database. First of all, we will distinguish between those two, and we will show the different rates. So, for example, if it's diesel with a full amount, and gasoline with a reduced rate, we would have two different lines. And if then there's an exemption for agricultural use of diesel, that will be, also, a separate line. So then to part of this diesel only because, so tax evasion is, of course, right. That's the second part of this answer. We do also record what the enforcement mechanism is for the specific tax example. I have to admit, we're not super granular though, because we assume that tax evasion for most taxes are treated in a very similar way. So we don't go into super great detail because this is a database on environmental, specifically climate change mitigation issues. Our colleagues in the tax directorate, also in the Center for Tax Policy, would be interested in more detail, I'm sure. But for this database, we found it was a bit too much to record. But yes, we do, at least on a relatively high level, nevertheless, record this. Gladly, yes. Thank you for the interesting questions.
Okay. Is there any last question before I move to closing this session of today's program? I see no further hands. Then Dirk and Astrid, I want to thank you warmly for this very nice presentation of a quite complex topic. And as everybody sees, there is contact detail, ifcma@oecd.org. Might you have further questions, and we can put you in touch with the team also for additional information. And and I also want to congratulate Astrid, Dirk, and all the other OECD colleagues who are of the Center for Tax Policy and Administration, also in the EPI division in the Environment Directorate, on their hard work on the Stocktake and the policy database. I think this is just 1 hour of presentation, but there has been 3 years of work on methodology development, testing in 3 different pilots, and in working towards publication of the database. So it's an enormous effort that's behind this small set of slides. So thank you once more, and I hope everybody has appreciated this session. We'll have a short break to allow everybody to get some lunch, and we'll be back at 1 p.m. To see IASA's work on global with their GloBiome and G4M models on modeling of the afforestation, forestry, and land use sectors and emissions and the relevant policies. So thank you all, and see you in 40 minutes. Bye.
Bye.